I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer at Gold Derby, joined today by five-time Emmy winner Onnalee Blank, who just received her ninth and 10th Emmy nominations for her work as the sound supervisor and re-recording mixer on Amazon Prime's 10-episode limited series, The Underground Railroad. First off, congratulations on your two Emmy nominations for sound mixing and sound editing, Onnalee.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I just alluded to, you are certainly not new to this. Before this year, you had received 8 nominations, 7 for Game of Thrones and 1 for Houdini. You have won 5 times, all for Game of Thrones. But how does it feel now to reach the double digits and to know that your peers in the TV Academy are not only paying attention to, but truly admiring and supporting your work?
Game of Thrones was such a phenomenon. I mean, billions of people watched that show. It became this whole cult following. And so something about getting recognized for my work that is not that show feels like, okay, yes, I broke through that barrier. So I'm glad people watched it. I know it's a very hard piece to watch, and it's nice to get some feedback that people liked the sound. So feels great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy. And before we get into the specifics of your work on the Underground Railroad, could you just briefly, for some of our viewers who may not be aware of the nuances, explain what your work as a sound supervisor and as a re-recording mixer entails and where these two differ?
Supervising sound editing, when I work with Barry, start the process as early as early script phase. I read the scripts and make a big Word document based off by scene, things that we need to record, things that we can be weird, other ideas, and just sort of get my mind and my headspace around what is going to be coming down the line. It takes me a while to sort of formulate my thoughts and figure out what we can do with this show. How can we make this sound different than just a Southern slave movie? And hiring a team of people, and based off of the script, different people have different expertise, and working with someone and try something different. Once they're done with cutting a scene, let's do it completely differently. And all about frequency ranges. And then re-recording mixing, I like to do a lot of sound design and sound effects work, but when I mix dialogue and music.
Interesting.
I actually don't like to necessarily mix what I create. I like to have Matthew Waters, the effects mixer, do that
Mm,
to get a fresh set of eyes, because I can be sometimes biased on certain things that I might have done, knowing how many hours I have put into something. And he'll just mute it. Yeah, that didn't work. I'm like, oh, what? And so it's a good balance, give and take. We've been mixing together for 12 years or something like that. So there's no personal hard feelings. Every once in a while something stings, but we have gotten to this really great working relationship where it's all about challenging each other and pushing ourselves to make the best sounding mix as possible, and
mhm,
also encouraging each other that we need to move on to the next scene. And maybe if
right.
this is not necessarily 100% perfect on what we want, we can circle back, and hopefully a new idea has refreshed in our brain from a night's sleep or a dream.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for shedding light on those differences. I always think that's incredibly interesting. So you and Barry Jenkins, who of course created the show, directed all 10 episodes, and wrote several episodes, go way back to 2011 when you mixed the short film Chlorophyll. And then you went on to work on his 2 features, Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk, a lot of the creative team on both of which Barry reassembled for the Underground Railroad, including composer Nicholas Bertel and editor Joy McMillan. How much does it facilitate or enhance the creative process when you're collaborating with so many of your longtime colleagues?
Well, it's great. There is there's like an underhand communication without even speaking. I know what Joy will want. I can text her, call her in the middle of the night, ask her questions, send her stuff, and it's a great back and forth. And we're friends to boot on top of it. And working with Nicholas Bertel is amazing. He is such a wonderful person, a gentle soul, and we were both sort of having mini freakouts during different phases on the Underground Railroad, just because it is like 13 movies, and
Oh,
each
yes.
episode you can't pull from the same material. It's a rebuild from the beginning every time, which was really challenging. And so, since some of the sound design is quite musical, uh, Nick and I would, speak once a week, sometimes twice a week, sometimes at midnight. Like, hey, what are you working on now? And then, oh, are you writing something for this scene? Where do you go out? And what key are you writing in? And trying to, and then I would send him stuff. He'd even want me to build a fire sequence of, forest fire that he wanted to incorporate the score. So then I would build him some stuff that then he would write around and then use in his piece of music, and trains. And it's a wonderful place to work with a composer, because uh, it just makes it for a better process. And he knows that I'm going to protect his music and work together. And it's about what's best for the story. What is each scene? What is the story trying to say character wise? And how can we enhance it, not hurt it?
Exactly. Yeah, that's very interesting. And let's just jump into the show, starting with the first episode titled Chapter One Georgia, which you and your team submitted for the Best Sound Mixing category at the Emmys. The
Mhm.
episode, of course, takes place almost exclusively on the Randall Plantation, which really is the most important location of the show. So, what was important to you when establishing the ambience of not only the plantation itself, but of the show in general? And what did that process look like?
What's interesting about episode one, mixing wise, is we mixed that the very last
Oh,
episode in the series. So it it took a long time to get there story wise. We kept pushing it further and further down the track, which actually helped out, because episode Mabel, that's on the same Randall Plantation, but it takes place years, 15 years earlier.
mhm,
So it the plantation is obviously busier in episode one. They have more slave, there's more activity, and it's setting up the entire space of the show. And there's this first scene where Cora and Caesar are talking around the tree, and then it cuts to they're having a party. And how could we make this fun and lively, creating versions of Shortening Bread song, different drum beats, but also make it creepy and eerie at the same time. Anytime we just kept coming back to it, adding different delays, trying different reverbs. What can we do to subconsciously make the audience go, oh, this is different than a regular slave movie? um, and we want to portray that early, so then the audience can sort of grasp, oh, this is different, this is actually sort of like a horror movie.
right.
So
And in that regard, especially in the first episode, there is quite a bit of violence. So how do you make sure that these sounds are effective and striking, but not gratuitous and overbearing?
that's a fine line to walk. Harry Cohen, who's an amazing sound designer, did all the whipping throughout the entire show. um, he he's like, I think we should be less hyper real. So we tried, at first they were really almost over the top. They would never sound like that. And the realer we made the whips, the more horrific it sounded, which is
Interesting.
the choice that we made, knowing that the audience might turn off the show, it might be too much for them. I kept telling all my friends, please make it through episode one. It's very gratuitous, but it does pay off, please. So, and after working on it for months, you do look past that and you start just looking through to seeing what's real, what's not, how can we enhance this. Anytime there's this little boy on screen, he doesn't have any lines, but he has, a character of him just breathing, and that's almost symbolize death in a way. So it's how can we create sound of a character that doesn't move? He just stands there. So
Absolutely.
it was a lot of trial and error and trying stuff, and some things didn't work. And
Yeah, and as you've already alluded to just now, you've described the Underground Railroad as a southern show meets a horror movie meets Twin Peaks. And I think that becomes particularly apparent in the second and third episodes, which take place in South and North Carolina, respectively. Could you elaborate on what techniques you and your team used to ultimately translate those thematic undertones, and whether there were ever any challenges while merging so many different genres and tones?
yeah, it was a fine line. We didn't want to get too big too soon.
Yeah.
And that's easy to do, especially when the little boy is trying to recite the Declaration of Independence, which is in 101. Um, the shots were, are all slowed down. How can we make this work without it being sci-fi? Because it's easy to go that route. So we did everything we can just to pull from naturalistic sounds and morph them in a way that sounds weird, like bullfrogs or trains that sound like elevators, and trying to look at the whole frequency range. It's really easy to rely on low end or subwoofer to feel certain frequencies to get a vibe from a movie. And it was nice to try to pull from like, something that was just a different sound that makes the audience kind of snap out of what they're listening to.
Very
Trial
interesting.
and error.
Yeah, absolutely. But in that regard, while the show takes place in the 1850s, it is not at all exclusive to that period in time in terms of the themes that it explores. I mean, we have everything from skyscrapers to trains to elevators, none of which feel out of place in the story, however. So how do you take something as familiar as an elevator or a train and place it in the context of this story in a way that is completely believable, while also diverging from the typical sounds of an elevator or of a train?
For instance, in episode 2, when she's riding up and down the elevator, and then she goes into this dream state, um, which is very Twin Peaky kind of vibe, even the colors, the color choices that they chose. I did not want to use any elevator sounds at all for the actual elevator. It was like a challenge, like whatever you do, don't use any elevator sounds. My FX editor looks like, okay. And so we recorded all the, this amazing 1831 steam train that was being moved from one museum to another. And Watson Wu, the field recordist, lined the train tracks with microphones. And what that sound created was distortion over modulation as the train was running by, which most people would be like, oh, that's a ruined recording. And I was like, this is the best thing ever. It's a gem. And so taking that particular sound and slowing it down, playing it on the keyboard, adding it to other different elements on top of each other, which created the entire elevator. And also some other sound design elements, which are in episode 10, all
Right.
over the place.
Yeah, that's an incredibly fascinating aspect of the show. And I'm going to jump now ahead to the ninth episode, titled Chapter 9, Indiana Winter, which your team submitted for the sound editing category. And while this episode starts calmly, it ends with this horrific massacre of the Valentine community and the destruction of their farm. When I interviewed Joy McMillan, who edited this episode, she described it as the calm before the storm and then the storm. Before we get into the massacre itself, just briefly talk me through how you and your team navigated this transition from calm before the storm to the storm.
Well, earlier, the character Ronald Ridgway, we created, and Jay Jennings had a great idea of almost like his time is running out. And how can we sell that without being music. So we created a motif that then was his almost musical motif of anvil hits and different kind of clocks and stopwatches and pocket watches. And so you'll notice throughout that entire episode, it starts off with the grandfather clock with
Yeah.
half-timed reverb delay that then gets pretty real towards the end, which then turns into anvil,
Mhm.
and then so the whole episode leading up before the storm is this ticking clock. And really, what does this ticking clock mean? And it changes from different elements, and then it pays off
Oh,
in a big way.
oh yeah, absolutely. And then there is the massacre. And in this massacre, we have gunshots, we have shattering glass, we have wood splintering, and in the middle of it all, we have slow motion shots and sequences and the sound of the clock ticking, like from Widge Race Pass that you already mentioned, and so much more. You were involved in so many large scale sequences, or worked on so many large scale sequences on Game of Thrones. I mean, Hard Home and Battle of the Bastards and The Long Night, for all three of which you won Emmys. But obviously this is different. So how was it, or what was it like working on this particular sequence?
Is how can we make this real sounding? We recorded loop group outside, and a lot of the guys who are yelling, who are having the guns and yelling, you can't discern what they're saying, which is excellent and exactly what I wanted. I hate when everything is very much on the nose. I like when things are messy, but then the sound of those, black powder guns are very real. Jay Jennings and Harry Cohen did a fabulous job on those guns. It has a lot of bite and sharp. It's okay to be loud and okay to scare the audience, and it's okay to make it brutal, but it's also on some of those slow-mo shots, you definitely don't want to be like, oh, like how can you make those slow-mo shots work with the elements that you have? And so Matt Waters and I did a lot of mixing techniques to take the elements we have and just morph them in a way with a whole bunch of different random stuff. Reverbs into reverbs back into the same reverb to create a loop that then goes around the room. And it's that was a brutal episode.
Oh, absolutely. But it turned out incredibly well, especially those final 20 minutes, which are, yeah, absolutely incredible. And on a final note, I would like to briefly touch on the finale titled Chapter 10 Mabel, which you've already mentioned. And I read it was actually one of the longest episodes you worked on. And I would like to specifically talk about the swamp scene with Sheila Adams' character, Mabel, Cora's mother, which relies almost exclusively on the sound and Sheila's performance. I found that the loud sounds of the bugs, for example, created such a claustrophobic atmosphere, one that completely reflects what is going on in Mabel's head in that very moment. Is that what you were going for in this particular scene?
Well, let me tell you how I got there. So that episode, Mabel is realizing that where she is, where she's living her life is terrible, and she's slowly losing her mind and her psyche as the episode continues. And I wanted to create her chaotic mind with high frequency material. And because something about the way high frequency triggers your brain, it can make you feel very, very unsettling. Recording all these 17-year cicadas was a big importance. So we put microphones up in the trees. So as she realizes what happens to her good friend Polly, which is extremely sad, the bugs and her high frequency starts getting really enhanced. And as she's walking through the swamp, all you hear is everything in the foreground is very prominent. The bugs are there, but the main element that you're hearing there is train, actually, these train recordings. And so And then when the camera pans over, we get completely silent because
Yeah.
I don't know why I just felt like I love to follow the camera pan and try to make the audience lean in. And once the audience is leaned in and you have this bit of silence, we did whatever we could to go as loud as possible just with the bugs and make not just stereo or 5.1 or 7.1 stems of these bugs, but mono and Atmos and things that can really feel the depth of field. And then when she realizes what she's doing, it's almost like the bugs snap her out, and she's then realizes she left her daughter back on the plantation. She starts returning home, and then things don't work out so well for her. I love that sequence.
Yeah, it's an incredible sequence, and it's such an interesting way to bookend this show, such a devastating way to bookend it. But
Yeah.
well, thank you so much, Onnalee, for joining me today and for shining light on your very interesting process. To our viewers, make sure to check out The Underground Railroad on Amazon Prime Video if you haven't already, and make sure to click subscribe before you leave. Thank you so much.